Thank you, Tim, and I guess staff of the church and Brandon. So appreciate you guys. Speaking of Thanksgiving, we've been talking about giving thanks. I looked in the worship guide. In fact, I did that a couple days ago. I noticed in the back where it talks about the giving and things that a couple of months ago, I guess 2.5 or so months ago, we were like $70,000 in the. These are what? Okay. Is that me or you? Or we don't know? So I should change subjects and talk about something else. Is that what you're trying to tell me? Okay. All right. So 2.5 months ago or so, we were like $70,000 in the hole, and today, as I read it right, we're about $79,000 to the good, which is about a $150,000 swing in a couple months. Yes, that's something to be thankful about. And so we're just glad what God is doing through you and your gifts. And so that's an exciting thing. And so that kind of plays into what I want to talk about this morning is that revival will cost you something. It will cost you something. And you need to hear that because a lot of us, maybe I'll say most of us, are hoping that we can have an encounter with God. We're hoping that we can have revival, and we don't have to change a whole lot in our lives. We can just sort of keep going the way we're going. It doesn't have to interfere with our lives. But look at this two ways. When you have an encounter with God, your priorities will change, or else you didn't have an encounter with God. Things will change in your life. But also understand this, a lot of times for God's people, in order to have an encounter with God, they have to change their priorities. Jesus said this over and over again, you cannot be my disciples unless, you cannot be my disciples unless. And how he would finish that, unless you, and I'll just paraphrase all that, unless you change your priorities. So you want to have an encounter with God, understand, things cannot stay the same. Your priorities will have to change in your life. You may probably not familiar with Tommy Moe, but he is the first American male ski racer to win 2 medals at one Olympics. He honed his skills at Alyeska, which is a ski resort about 35 miles south of Anchorage. And at all his Olympic victories, you could see his father waving the Alaska state flag back and forth. But his story, how it began, was when he was 15 years old, he was asked to be on the American ski team. But then he got caught sneaking out at night smoking marijuana. He got kicked, excuse me. He got kicked off the ski team. So his father owns a construction company in Alaska. Things just swallowed the wrong way. Tommy Moe doesn't choke me up, I promise you. Good guy, but doesn't do that. And so Tommy's spending 12 to 16 hours a day working for his father's construction company in Alaska during the summer. And his father turns to him after a couple months of doing that. He turns to him and says, would you rather be working construction or would you rather be practicing with the ski team in Argentina? He rearranges his priorities, winds up winning gold in the 96 Olympics. Moses was somebody else who had to rearrange his priorities in order to connect with God. You know, we're talking about Moses here. He's the one who got the 10 Commandments from God. He's the one who wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. He's the one that led the children of Israel from captivity right to the edge of the promised land. God was able to do a lot of great things through him. Why? Because he rearranged his priorities. He saw different things as important. And so what I want us to do today is to see what Moses did in order to connect with God. So we're going to go through Moses' life here and see what he did in order to be connected to God, in order to have a relationship with God. The first thing he did was he had to learn to be yourself. God made you for a purpose. You need to be who God created you to be. See, in Moses' life out the bat, he suffered an identity crisis. Who am I? Because he was born Jewish, but he was raised as an Egyptian. So this is what we read in Hebrews 11, verse 24. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. That word refuse, to deny, to totally disown. Moses could have chose to live like an Egyptian, basically to live a lie. And if he would have done that, he would have had it made. He would have had all the perks that come with being the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Or he could choose to live as a Jew, and that meant being kicked out of Pharaoh's court and living a life of slavery. But Moses' conscience wouldn't let him live a lie. So he made a choice. He refused, totally disowned, said, no, I'm not going to live a lie. I'm going to live who I was created to be. And what we need to understand is that there's something very freeing about being yourself. Because you want to have an ulcer, just try and be somebody you're not. And what that means to you is that God created you and recreated you. You're a child of God. Why would you want to live like a pagan? Why would you want to live straddling the fence all the time, halfway in and halfway out? Be yourself. Be who God created you to be. So you want to connect with God, you want to have an encounter with God, the first thing, be yourself. The second thing, accept responsibility for your life. Be responsible. Here's what we read. And choose, this is continuing what we left off, and chose to suffer with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. The key word is chose. To decide. You have to make a choice. Are you going to accept responsibility for your life or not? Because in our world, it's all about, oh, it's okay, you're not responsible. You can blame somebody else. You can put it off on somebody else. It's not my fault. When did Moses make this decision? When did he choose this? Let's go back up to verse 24. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter and chose to suffer with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. So when did Moses make this choice? When he had grown up. So listen, young people and not so young people. You want to know when you've grown up? It's when you accept responsibility for your life. When you quit blaming other people for the choices that you make, for decisions that you make. Because our world will not only let you, they'll encourage you to say, it's not my fault. I didn't do this, to put it off on somebody else. It's because your mother held you under the bathwater when you were 6 months old, just a little bit too long. That's the reason you have all these emotional problems. That's the reason you're raping and pillaging today. It's her fault. It's not your fault. That's what our world will push you to. You can't blame somebody else for decisions in your life, just like you can't live off of somebody else's spiritual relationship. It's got to be your own. You have to take your own responsibility. Nobody can mess up your life but you. Ultimately, people can mess up your life, but nobody can ultimately mess up your life but you. God won't. He loves you too much. Satan can't. He doesn't have the power. The only person who can ultimately, totally mess your life up is you. So you want to have an encounter with God? This is what Moses had to go through. Be yourself. Take responsibility for your life. And third, establish a value system. Here's what we read next, verse 26. For he considered reproach for the sake of Christ to be greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, since he was looking ahead to the reward. That word considered, to count the cost, to weigh the issues. See, you have to decide what's important to you. This is not something you do haphazardly. This is not something you just take a few minutes out of your life and say, okay, let me decide this real quick. Let me do this during the invitation of the church. No, this is something you have to sit down and consider, to weigh the options, to go through this. and to consider it. Moses considered, he counted, he weighed the options, and he believed that following God's will was more important than all the treasures he could have out of Egypt. Moses decided what was really important to him. Because if you don't decide your values, somebody else will do it for you. You don't decide how to spend your money, somebody else will decide it for you. If you don't decide how to spend your time, somebody else will decide that for you. You need to decide what are your values, what's important to you. What does the world consider important? What's the world's values? We saw that in these 3 verses. It's power. I want to be somebody. I want to be popular. I want to be known. It's power. It's pleasure. I want to feel good. It's possessions. I want to have all the cool toys. And here's the thing. All that stuff, power, possessions, and pleasures, that was wrapped up in being the son of Pharaoh's daughter. It came with it. Who would turn their back on power, possessions, and pleasure? Somebody with a different value system. Somebody who saw things differently. And what Moses teaches us, and this is very important, he teaches us that sometimes you have to say no. In fact, you want to follow after God, you will have to say no. So if I come to you and say, do you want to have a relationship with God? Do you want to have all your sins forgiven? Do you want to go to heaven when you die? Do you want to have somebody who will walk with you through life and never leave you or forsake you? Who would say no to that? But in order to say yes to God, you have to say no to some things. If you don't say no to some things, Jesus calls that a double-minded man. He says you can't serve 2 masters. Either you love one or hate the other. You have to decide. Because what Moses, and what we're going to go through and see in just a minute, is you can't do both. One of them has to be more important. One of them you have to say yes to, one of them you have to say no to. You can't say yes to both these things. So, Moses teaches us that you have a choice. Here's one thing. Moses decided, this is what his priority became, he decided that God's purpose is more valuable than power. Let's go back to verse 24 again. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Don't you know the son of Pharaoh's daughter came with perks? The big man on campus, the up-and-coming yuppie, the one people bow down to. But the thing about Moses, he wasn't too impressed with himself, was he? He decided he'd rather be a slave and be connected to God than be Pharaoh or in line to be Pharaoh and not connected to God. So he decided God's purpose for his life was more important than power. He couldn't have both. He had to make a decision. And you need to hear that. You need to hear this through all these things we're going to talk about. You're going to have to say no to some things if you want to have an encounter with God. Your priorities have to change. Secondly, Moses decided people are more valuable than pleasures. Here's what we read in verse 25. And chose to suffer with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. People were more important than pleasures. Was Moses' life, was it wrapped up in pleasures being the son of Pharaoh's daughter? You bet. If he wanted his grapes peeled, they were peeled. Whatever whim he had, the slaves would come and fulfill it. And he talks about the pleasures, backing up here, he talks about the fleeting pleasures of sin. Because there's pleasure in sin, right? Sure. You wouldn't do it if there wasn't. There is pleasure, but it's only for a while. It doesn't last. Paul talks about you reap what you sow. In other words, the pleasure of sin is not worth the payoff. And so he had to realize this. We would never sin if it was painful. But it does bring pleasure. It's just not worth the payoff. So Moses decided that people were more important than pleasures. And thirdly, Moses decided that God's peace is more valuable than possessions. Here's what we read in the next verse, verse 26. For he considered reproach for the sake of Christ to be greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, since he was looking ahead to the reward. So he considered that God's peace was more valuable than possessions and treasures. You cannot find a happiness. You cannot find it. You cannot buy happiness with things. Let me rephrase that. You can't buy ultimate happiness with things. Because you can buy happiness for a little bit, for a little while. But things, possessions, is not going to bring happiness. You'll see it this Christmas. The thing you have to have in a few months, so what? You go on to something else. Jesus put it this way. Life does not consist in the abundance of possessions. And we say we believe that, then we spend our life trying to prove that that isn't true. So Moses had to decide power, pleasures, and possessions. What's really important to me? And he had to say no to those things in order to have an encounter with God. The fourth thing that we learned from Moses, never take your eyes off the goal. Back to verse 26. For he considered reproach for the sake of Christ to be greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, since he was looking ahead to the reward. He had a goal. He understood there was more to this life than just this life. There was something else coming. And that's what he had his eyes on. That's what he was looking for. We read on, by faith he left Egypt behind, not being afraid of the king's anger, for Moses persevered as one who sees him who is invisible. Sees. It's as if his connection with God was so strong, he could see what was coming. He could see and have that being drawn to being in God's presence. So 5 words stick out as we go through this passage. The first one, refused. The second one, chose. The third one, considered. The fourth one, saw. And the fifth one, persevered. Going back up to that verse, can we back up to verse 27? Moses persevered as one who sees him who is invisible. Persevered. See, you can't have progress without problems. That's just the way life is. You want to have progress, you're going to have problems. Moses had problems. He had to persevere. What did he have to persevere? What did he have to live through? For one thing, 2 million spiritual babies. He had to listen to them cry and whine for 40 years. Why? Because they never wanted to change their priorities. They never really wanted to be connected with God and change who they were. So he had to live with them for 40 years. He had to persevere, waiting a long time for an answer to prayer. From the time where he wanted to be a deliverer of God's people to the time he saw fulfillment of that was 80 years. That's a long time to wait for an answered prayer. He persevered. He hung in there in the midst of all this. He didn't give up. So, Moses ended up as somebody who had a heart for God, who knew how to persevere, who had all these things going on in his life. But it didn't start out that way, did it? You remember the burning bush? God says, Moses, you're the one. Moses, maybe not. And again says, no, you're the one. Moses, I don't think so. God says, Moses, you're the one. And finally, Moses just says, no, not me. That's what the Bible calls grieving the Spirit when you say no. Another phrase the Bible uses for that is despising prophetic utterances. That's when you come to church and the preacher's up giving the word of God and you say, yes, that's truth, and you walk out of here and you don't change a single thing in your life to line up with that truth. That's called despising a prophetic utterance. So a good question to ask is, what are you saying no to right now? What does God want you to do that you're saying no to? I'm so glad Noah didn't say, sorry, God, I don't do boats. Glad Rahab didn't say, God, no, I don't do spies. Glad Ruth didn't say, I don't do mother-in-laws. Glad Paul didn't say, I don't do letters. Glad Jesus didn't say, I don't do crosses. What is it that you're telling God you won't do? What Moses teaches us, you want to have an encounter with God? Be yourself. Quit living a lie. Be who you were created to be. In other words, God doesn't do fakes. He doesn't come and do something in the life of a fake. The next thing, you want to have an encounter with God? Be responsible. God doesn't do irresponsible people. Quit trying to pass the buck. The life you have now is a result of decisions you made. You're the only one who can ultimately totally mess up your life. You want to be connected with God? Change your values. Determine what's really important to you. And that's not easy because it's going to require you to say no. And you want to be connected with God? Keep your eyes on the goal. Know what's coming. A life with Him. Have your heart, your mind set on heaven. Let me give you something to put on your coffee cup. You people drink a lot of coffee around here. This will go in your coffee cup, okay? Your happiness is determined by your character. Your character is determined by your choices. Your choices are determined by your values, and your values are determined by your vision, what you focus on. So your character is determined by your happiness. Your happiness is determined by your character. Your character is determined by your choices. Your choices is determined by your values. Your values is determined by your vision, what you focus on. What are you looking at as your end goal? As a baby, God chose Moses. Nile River, the whole thing being spared. God chose Moses. But when Moses grew up, Moses chose God. And that may be where some of you are at. God wants you, but you have to decide, are you going to choose God? Now, that'll mess with some of your Calvinistic minds, but you have that choice to make, okay? And it's time for you to choose that. For others of you, you want to connect with God, it's going to cost you something. But I'll tell you this, it's worth everything. It's worth it all to be connected to Him. You want to see revival? You can't continue on doing life the way you do it without changing things. How you view things, what's important to you, where you spend your time, your money. You can't experience that connection with God, that encounter with God, without changing something. And we don't like that. Because we're comfortable, right? We got our lifestyle. We got how we do life, how we view life, how we spend our money, how we do our possessions and everything else. We're in a rut with that. And that's the problem. We've been in a rut with that as God's people for 60 years. You have to be willing to change if you want to have an encounter with God. So that's the invitation this morning. Is it time for you to choose God and to become a Christ follower? And as a Christ follower, is God calling you to change, to have different priorities in your life? And you can say no. And you can live the rest of your life just like those children of Israel from the time they got out of Egypt, came up to the promised land a couple weeks later, said, no, God, we can't do this. And what did they do? They spent the next 40 years just dying off, worthless to God. Why? Because they wouldn't change their priorities. Their faith wasn't going to grow. It didn't need to be any different than the way they always had been. Their outlook, and it didn't change at all. They continued being slaves. God says, no, you're my people. No, we're slaves. Let's go back to Egypt. How many times they say, let's go back to Egypt and live as slaves? No. You don't want to live your life that way. You want to know what it's like to have an encounter with God, to have him burn in your life like he did in Moses' life. And you want to spend the rest of your years here on earth having God burn in your life, not living as a slave. So we're going to sing hymn invitation. You guys can. And as we do so, if God is leading you to become a Christian, to become a Christ follower today, you just come down front and say, Randy, I want to give my life to Christ. I want to be a Christ follower. And we'll talk about that, and we'll meet during the week, and we'll talk about that some more, and we'll put you on that road, that pathway. Or you may want to say, Randy, I'm ready to take this next step. I'm tired of saying no to what God wants me to do. I'll be happy to come spend time with you, and let's talk about that. And let's get you on the road to changing your priorities and what they need to be. So whatever decision you need to make, I pray you'll make it. Let's stand together as we sing.